Welcome to the deep dive. You know how some topics just spark intense global debate, touching on theology, law, social norms, everything?
Definitely.
Well, today we're really going to dig into one of the most prominent ones, the global conversation around what's often called LGBTQ plus issues.
And our mission in this deep dive really is to systematically explore the Islamic perspective on this phenomenon. We want to shortcut to understanding the Islamic legal framework
How are we doing that?
by looking straight at the primary sources, the Quran, Sunnah, the Prophet Muhammad's teachings, the consensus of scholars, and the deeper wisdom behind the rulings.
Okay.
We're aiming to extract the most important nuggets, really, to help you grasp Islam's clear and consistent stance on this.
I think this is going to be incredibly insightful. So what can you expect? We'll unpack how classical Islamic texts define and approach these behaviors. We'll look at lessons from prophetic stories. We'll get into the detailed guidance from the Prophet himself, and then see how leading Islamic legal schools have interpreted and applied these principles, across centuries, right up to modern legal opinions or fatwas.
It's quite a journey, tracing it through.
It is. So let's jump right into the foundations, how Islamic texts actually define these things, and this really crucial idea of fitrah.
Yeah, fitrah.
Because it's important to get this up front.
Right.
Classical Islamic jurisprudence, faith, it doesn't use that modern umbrella term LGBT. It's much more specific.
That's a key distinction, yeah. It uses precise terms for specific actions. For instance, liwath.
The liwath. Okay, what's that specifically?
That term refers specifically to male homosexual relations. It's directly linked in Islamic tradition to the people of Prophet Lut, or Lot.
Right, the story everyone knows.
Exactly. They're seen as the first to practice this on a mass scale. And the Quran describes this act as fashiyah,
Which means?
an abominable deed. It's considered one of the gravest major sins, the kabair, in Islam. Extremely serious.
Okay, and for women?
The term is sihaq. That refers to female homosexual relations, lesbianism. Its prohibition isn't usually tied to a specific story like liwath, but rather from the general divine command to guard chastity.
Guard chastity.
Yeah, and limit sexual desire exclusively to lawful marital partners. The Quran in Surah Al-Mu'minin, verses 5-7, it's quite clear. Those who seek gratification beyond their lawful spouses are called transgressors.
Got it. And there are other terms too, right, about imitation?
Yes, takhannuth and tarajjul. The takhannuth is when men deliberately imitate women in behavior, speech, appearance, and tarajjul is the reverse, women imitating men.
And how are these viewed?
These actions are explicitly cursed by Prophet Muhammad in authentic hadiths. That curse signifies they are major sins. It's not just about clothes. It's seen as rejecting a divinely ordained gender identity.
Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting, this distinction between modern discourse and the Islamic framework. Because modern conversations often separate orientation, maybe innate, from action as choice, but Islamic law seems to approach it differently.
Exactly. Islamic law doesn't really use that separation as a basis for justification. It directly addresses the behavior, liwath and sihaq, as a criminal act. Yes. And the imitation tasyabu, which covers takhannuth and tarajjul, that's described as cursed. So it's a holistic approach and a preventive one, too.
So the issue isn't just the final sexual act.
Precisely. It also includes the manifestation of identity and gender expression when it fundamentally rejects, from the Islamic view, Allah's created order.
And the core reason, the bedrock for all these prohibitions, you mentioned it earlier, fitrah. Can you unpack that a bit more?
Fitrah, yeah. It's the innate, straight disposition that Islam teaches us Allah instilled in every human being at creation. Think of it like humanity's factory settings.
Okay, like a natural baseline.
A natural, healthy baseline Allah intended. And a fundamental aspect of this fitrah is that humans were created in pairs, male and female.
Right, the Quran mentions that.
Yes, Surah Al-Hujurat, verse 13. O mankind, indeed, we have created you from male and female. And the purpose of this pairing.
Family, procreation.
Exactly. To form families through lawful marriage. Marriage is seen as the source of tranquility, sakina, love, mawada, and mercy, Rama. And crucially, it's the sole legitimate path for human procreation, hifz and nasal.
Hifz and nasal, protecting progeny.
Which is itself one of the supreme objectives of Islamic law, the Makoshid Asisiria.
So, tying it back, if fitrah is this divine blueprint, how does Islam view behaviors that seem to deviate from it? What's the core takeaway?
Well, the Islamic perspective views the entire spectrum of what's now called LGBT behavior as a deviation from fitrah.
Deviation.
Yes. It's often framed as a disease to be rectified, not simply a normal variation. Now, it's stressed this isn't rooted in, say, hatred or simple discrimination.
But
Rather, in protecting that human fitrah, the sanctity of marriage and the continuity of generations, it's about maintaining what's seen as the natural, divinely intended order.
that explanation of fitrah really does provide a critical foundation. Okay, so with that in mind, where do we find the sort of earliest, most powerful warnings about deviating from this blueprint?
For Muslims, the answer is very clear. It lies powerfully in the Quran, specifically in that recurring story of Prophet Lut's people.
Recurring is the key word there, isn't it?
Absolutely. The Quran tells their story repeatedly. Their destruction is presented as a fundamental lesson and, importantly, a legal basis for the prohibition of homosexuality. The repetition itself shows the gravity.
So what do the verses actually say?
Several chapters recount it. In Surah Al-Araf, verses 80 to 84, Prophet Lut condemns the fa'izya, the abomination, as unprecedented. He says, "Why do you commit such an abomination as no one has committed before you?"
Unprecedented globally at that time.
Yes, and it explicitly describes men pursuing lust with other men instead of women. Very direct.
Then there's Surah, right? That one's quite dramatic.
Extremely. Verses 77 to 83. It details the angels arriving as handsome youths and Lut's people aggressively demanding them.
And Lut's response.
In desperation, he offers his own daughters. He says, "These are my daughters. They are pure for you." And their outright rejection of that offer is seen as powerfully refuting any modern argument that maybe only non-consensual acts were forbidden then.
Because it shows the issue was their inclination itself, not just force.
Precisely. Their problem was who they were attracted to, rejecting the natural alternative offered. And the punishment described is devastating.
What was it?
The city overturned Ja'alna aliyaha safilaha and rained upon with burning clay stones, hijara min sijil, is presented as a sign of immense divine wrath for this specific sin.
And other chapters.
Surah As-Suara, verses 160 to 175, has Lut asking this piercing question: "Why do you approach males among mankind and leave those whom your Lord has created for you as your wives? Indeed, you are transgressing beyond bounds."
So it directly contrasts homosexual acts with God's design for heterosexual marriage.
Unequivocally. It highlights the violation of creation's purpose. And then Surah Al-Ankabut adds another layer.
What's that?
Verses 28 to 30. It suggests this sexual deviation wasn't isolated. It was part of a total societal moral collapse robbery, open wickedness in gatherings.
So homosexuality became a symbol of a broader rebellion.
Exactly. A symbol of collective rebellion against divine order, not just an individual failing.
How did the classical scholars interpret these verses?
Well, figures like Imam Ibn Kathir consistently saw them as clear, undeniable prohibitions. The punishment was a direct consequence of openly practiced homosexual acts. Sayyid Qutb, another influential commentator, described the overturning of the city as a fitting recompense for reversing fitrah, a total reversal of order.
And the wisdom behind repeating this story so many times in the Quran.
Several reasons are given. First, to strengthen Prophet Muhammad and the early Muslims, showing resilience against opposition. Second, it's an eternal warning, a wa'id and nadsir for all humanity, a sign of consequences.
And legally.
Third, and perhaps most crucial for law, it provides definitive, unquestionable legal proof, dalil qafi, for the absolute prohibition of homosexual practices in Islamic law. It's foundational.
Okay, so the Quranic basis is very strong. What about beyond the Quran? The Sunnah, the Prophet Muhammad's teachings and practices, and also what his companions did.
Right, the Sunnah and the actions of the companions provide further, very strong affirmation. The Prophet's hadiths, his sayings and actions, they don't just lay groundwork for punishment. They also establish what you could call a preventive moral architecture.
Preventive? How so?
Well, let's start with the hadiths on punishment, Uqba. One of the foundational ones for establishing criminal sanctions comes from Ibn Abbas.
What did it say?
The Prophet Muhammad is reported to have said, "Whoever you find doing the deed of Lut's people, then kill the doer and the one to whom it is done."
Kill both. That's extremely severe.
It signifies the extreme seriousness of this crime in Islamic law. It puts it on par with other capital offenses established in the Sharia.
You also mentioned the concept of lana, divine curse. What does that imply, practically?
Lana means expulsion from Allah's mercy. And when we talk about that, it's not just a word. It signifies being cut off from divine favor, from blessings. For a believer, that's incredibly serious.
It indicates the act is deeply abhorrent to God.
deeply. Prophet Muhammad specifically cursed those who do the deed of loose people. There's a hadith from Imam Ahmad where he repeats, Allah curses whoever does the deed of loose people 3 times.
3 times for emphasis.
For immense emphasis, yes, underscoring the gravity. The Prophet even stated this behavior was his greatest fear for his community, his ummah. And this curse, importantly, also extends to tasyabu.
The imitation of the opposite gender we talked about.
Exactly, which emphasizes, again, it's not just about clothing or superficial things, but about rejecting a divinely ordained gender identity, seen perhaps as a precursor to sexual deviation.
So it seems Islam isn't just about punishment after the fact, but also about preventing the conditions that might lead to these acts.
That's a very important aspect. Islam employs the principle of Sadd al-Zariya,
Meaning?
closing the doors to evil, blocking the means that might lead to something forbidden. Several hadiths act as clear preventive measures.
Like setting up fences, you mean?
That's a good analogy, like a fence around a dangerous cliff. These rules are like that fence, keeping people from getting too close to the edge. For example, there's the prohibition on looking at private parts, even between people of the same gender.
Can you elaborate?
Imam Muslim narrates a hadith. No man should look at the private parts of another man, nor should a woman look at the private parts of another woman. And it continues. Nor should a man touch another man under one garment, nor a woman touch another woman under one garment.
So clear physical boundaries are set.
Yes, to prevent arousal and forbidden acts between people of the same sex. It establishes modesty as a core principle.
What else falls under this prevention principle?
Another example is the command to separate children's beds at age 10. This is seen as part of early Islamic education on modesty and boundaries.
Instilling propriety from a young age.
Exactly, preventing inappropriate physical interaction that could potentially lead to deviation later on.
Yeah.
It's about nurturing that fitrah from early childhood.
So if you take all these hadiths together, the punishments, the curses, the preventative measures,
They establish what you could call a comprehensive moral architecture. A whole system designed to foster a healthy social environment where sexual instincts are channeled exclusively towards lawful marriage, protecting purity and order.
And what about the companions of the Prophet? How did they handle this? Was there agreement?
Yes, there was unanimous consensus, Ijma, among the Prophet's companions, especially the rightly guided caliphs, on the absolute prohibition of liwath and on the necessity of severe legal sanctions.
Unanimous on prohibition and severity. But were the sanctions uniform?
This is interesting. While they agreed on the severity, they actually differed on the specific methods of execution.
Oh, like how?
For instance, Abu Bakr reportedly favored execution by sword, followed by burning. Umar and Uthman are said to have ordered crushing under a wall. Ali reportedly ordered stoning in one instance, burning in another. And Abdul bin Abbas suggested throwing from the highest point in the city, then stoning.
Wow, those are varied and harsh methods.
Yeah.
What does that variation tell us?
It actually underscores their shared seriousness. The differences reflect their independent legal reasoning, their ijtihad, trying to determine the most fitting retribution for what they saw as an incredibly grave offense. But the core agreement on the prohibition and its severity was absolute.
Okay, so that takes us from the Prophet and his companions. Let's move forward to the founders of the Najr schools of fiqh, Islamic law. How do they codify this?
What's striking here is the continued absolute consensus among them regarding the prohibition, even while they explored differences in the specific legal sanctions.
Absolute consensus on prohibition again.
Yes, a cornerstone. All 4 major Sunni schools, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi, Hanbali, and Shia schools too, they are in complete agreement, Ijma, that liwath is strictly forbidden, haram, and is categorized as one of the greatest sins, kabair. Based on those clear, definitive proofs, the Qawthi evidence from the Quran's story of Luth's and the Sunnah's curses and punishment hadiths we discussed. No ambiguity there for them.
So, if they all agree it's forbidden and a major sin, what do the differences in legal sanctions actually look like? Why the variation?
It's not a difference in their moral stance on the act itself. It reflects the richness, really, and the sophistication of Islamic jurisprudence, different ways of applying legal principles.
Okay. Can you walk us through some examples?
Sure. The Maliki and Hanbali schools, for instance, generally hold that the punishment for liwath is the death penalty, often by stoning, rajam, whether the person is married or unmarried.
Why death for both?
Their reasoning is that they consider it even more heinous than adultery, zina, or at least equal to adultery's most severe punishment. They derive this directly from that Ibn Abbas hadith about killing both parties and the companions' consensus on capital punishment being necessary.
Okay, that's Maliki and Hanbali. What about the Shafi'i school?
The strongest view in the Hanafi school equates the punishment for liwath to that of zina, so following the rules for adultery or fornication.
Which means?
Which means 100 lashes and a year of exile for unmarried individuals, and stoning to death for married ones. Mushan. Their reasoning is based on qiyas, or analogy.
Analogy with what?
An analogy with zina, due to the shared underlying legal cause, which they see as unlawful sexual penetration. Though, it's worth noting, there's another view within the Saifi school that hopefully aligns more with the Malikis and Hanbalis, supporting outright death.
Right. And the Hanafi school, they have a different approach, I understand.
They do, yeah. Quite unique methodologically. They argue that liwath isn't strictly zina by definition.
Why not?
Because zina, in their technical definition, specifically affects lineage, proof of parentage. Since liwath doesn't have that potential consequence, they argue the fixed Quranic punishment for zina, the had, doesn't automatically apply.
And the hadith about killing.
They also argue that the hadith isn't mutawatir, meaning not transmitted through so many chains of narrators at each stage to reach the absolute highest level of certainty required, in their view, to establish a had punishment like death.
So, if it's not had, what is the punishment according to Hanafis?
It falls under tazir,
Which is?
a discretionary punishment decided by the judge, the qadi. But, and this is crucial, tazir here does not mean light.
Right. Discretion doesn't mean leniency necessarily.
Exactly. It can range from severe lashing to imprisonment or even the death penalty, especially for repeat offenders, or if the act is seen as causing severe harm to society or involves other crimes like rape. The judge has discretion, but the severity is still possible.
So what's the main takeaway from these differing legal applications across the schools?
It really showcases the depth and the internal logic of Islamic legal methodology. All schools unequivocally condemn the act as forbidden and a major sin. Their differences lie purely in how they apply specific legal principles, analogy, hadith classification, definitions to arrive at the precise, enforceable criminal sanction.
They're all trying to uphold the same divine prohibition, just using slightly different legal toolkits to determine the consequence.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. Now let's try and connect all of this technical legal discussion to the sort of deeper wisdom, the bigger picture. What's known as Makoshid Asisiaria.
The higher objectives of Islamic law. Yeah.
Imagine, for our listener, a legal framework where the highest goal is ensuring society's well-being, protecting essential needs for survival and morality for now and future generations. How would that framework view behaviors that seem to undermine those goals?
That's exactly where understanding the Makoshid becomes so illuminating. The prohibitions we've discussed are seen as directly aligning with Islam's overarching goals to protect 5 essential aspects of human life. The al-daruriyat al-khamsa.
The 5 essentials. What are they in this context?
Okay, first, there's protecting religion, hifz ad-din. From this perspective, accepting or legitimizing something Allah explicitly forbids undermines the very foundation of faith, which is submission and obedience to God.
Makes sense. What's next?
Protecting life self, hifz an-nafs. There's often a link drawn here to public health. Medical studies, particularly before modern treatments, highlighted higher risks of certain serious STIs like HIV/AIDS and syphilis associated with some homosexual practices, especially among males. So the prohibition is seen partly as a protection for individual and public health.
Okay.
Third,
protecting intellect, hifz al-aql. The argument here is that justifying relationships that fundamentally contradict the biological basis of creation for procreation is seen as a deviation from sound, rational thought, which Islam encourages, aligning with fitrah.
And that leads directly to the fourth one, which seems very central.
Protecting progeny, hifz an-nasl. Yes, this is perhaps the most direct link. Homosexual relations are inherently sterile. So normalizing them is seen as undermining marriage as the sole legitimate vehicle for procreation, thereby threatening the continuity of human generations and the family structure itself.
The family structure being key.
Absolutely fundamental in Islamic social structure. And finally, fifth, protecting wealth, hifz amal.
How does that connect? It seems less direct. It's more indirect. The argument is that the breakdown of the traditional family unit, which these prohibitions aim to protect, can disrupt legal structures around financial support, inheritance, guardianship, potentially affecting broader economic and societal stability, since the family is the basic economic unit.
So if you tie all these 5 maqashid together, religion, life, intellect, progeny, wealth, what's the big picture message about these prohibitions?
The message is that the prohibition isn't just an isolated moral rule floating on its own. It's seen as a crucial pillar supporting the entire framework of the Maqasid. Undermining it from this perspective has far-reaching negative consequences for the well-being and stability of individuals, families, and society as a whole. It's all interconnected.
And this deep wisdom, this framework, it continues to inform contemporary Islamic thought and legal rulings, right?
Yes, absolutely. We see it playing out in various Muslim contexts. A clear example is the Fatwa issued by the Majelis Ulema Indonesia, the MUI, back in 2014. Fatwa number 57.
What did that fatwa say? How does it apply these classical ideas today?
It's quite comprehensive and directly applies classical principles. It reaffirms the absolute prohibition of homosexual acts, categorizing them as crimes, jarima. It recommends tazir punishment, decided by the state.
Discretionary punishment.
Yes, and it explicitly mentions the possibility of the death penalty in cases like child sodomy or molestation, reflecting that potential severity of tazir. It also explicitly rejects the legalization of LGBT activities or same-sex marriage.
And it urged the government.
It urged the Indonesian government not to recognize or provide space for such communities or activities. So it's a very clear application of the classical consensus in a modern national context.
Now, in the global discussion today, we often hear arguments trying to reinterpret Islamic texts, especially where they clash with modern secular values. How does Islamic scholarship typically respond? For instance, the orientation versus behavior argument.
Well, as we discussed, the traditional view points back to the story of Lut's people. Their rejection of women is seen as indicating an issue with inclination itself, not just isolated acts. Plus, the Hadiths on tasyabu, imitation, forbid deviant identity expression too. So that distinction isn't accepted as a justification for the forbidden actions or identities.
Okay, what about the appeal to human rights? That comes up a lot.
The response from within the Islamic framework is usually that human rights are not absolute or defined solely by humans. They are bounded by the limits set by the Creator, by Allah.
So rights are granted by God and can't contradict his law.
Essentially, yes. Using a human-defined concept of rights to legitimize acts explicitly forbidden by God is seen as a fundamental error, because the Creator's commands take precedence.
And finally, what about contextual interpretation, arguing that maybe those verses applied only to a specific historical context?
When it comes to verses with clear, definitive meanings, Quathi Adalah, especially those supported by centuries of scholarly consensus, Ijma, attempting to fundamentally change their meaning based on modern context is generally rejected.
It's seen not as interpretation, but as
tarif, distortion of meaning. The understanding is that while context is important for application, it doesn't nullify eternal, fundamental moral laws that are clearly stated in the primary sources. The prohibition itself remains timeless in this view.
Okay, so as we bring this deep dive to a close, let's just try to summarize the core findings. The overwhelming consensus we've seen from the Quran, the Sunnah, the Ijma of companions, and later scholars
is that the practices and lifestyle associated with what is now termed LGBT are absolutely forbidden, haram, in Islam. They're considered major sins and a serious deviation from the human fitrah, that natural state.
So Islam views these acts as abnormal and fundamentally contrary to the divine design for creation.
That's the classical and mainstream understanding, yes. Therefore, any attempts to normalize or legalize them, whether arguing from human rights, personal freedom, or even potential genetic factors, are seen as fundamentally contradicting core Islamic principles.
And marriage within Islam remains
a sacred bond exclusively between a man and a woman. That definition is considered fixed and non-negotiable.
Right. But here's maybe a final provocative thought for you, our listener, to consider. While Islam strongly condemns the act, what about the individual?
That's a crucial point of nuance. The door of repentance, tawbah, and Allah's mercy is always emphasized as being open. For individuals who sincerely regret the actions, cease them, and commit not to return to them, forgiveness is available from God.
And society's role, it's not about vigilantism.
Absolutely not. It's crucial to clarify that the enforcement of legal sanctions, the uquba, is solely the authority of a legitimate Islamic state, not individuals or imams. Society's role isn't persecution.
Instead,
the Muslim community is seen as having a duty to provide guidance, education, and potentially rehabilitative support for those who struggle, but seek to return to the path aligned with fitrah.
What kind of support?
This could include medical, psychological, or spiritual approaches aiming to help individuals manage or overcome tendencies deemed contrary to fitrah and live according to Islamic teachings. It's a compassionate approach towards the individual seeking help.
So it's a balance.
Exactly. It's presented as a nuanced path, firmly condemning and rejecting the normalization and public promotion of the acts and lifestyle to protect societal morality and order, while always extending the hand of mercy, guidance, and support to individuals who seek sincere repentance and wish to change. That's the balance Islam aims for.